Every parent is supposed to protect their child, but some children have to protect themselves from their parents. 16-year-old Callie has learned this harsh truth, living in a forgotten trailer park, where her alcoholic father sees her as nothing more than a burden to be rid of. When he tries to sell her to pay off his gambling debts, a gruff mechanic named Dean shows up with cash. The whole town assumes they know what's happening when they see a middle-aged man paying money for a vulnerable girl. But Dean isn't buying a person. He's trying to save one. This widowed father lost his own teenage daughter years ago, and he sees something in Callie that everyone else has missed. What Dean really plans to do will shock this small town and change both their lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Pine Ridge Trailer Park, illuminating the rust stains and cracked vinyl siding that told stories of dreams deferred and hopes abandoned. Callie Henderson sat on the concrete steps of trailer number 47, watching her breath form small clouds in the crisp October air. Her worn notebook lay open across her knees, the pages yellowed and soft from countless hours of writing, her only confidant in a world that had forgotten how to listen. "Maybe today will be different," she whispered to the empty page, her pen hovering uncertainly above lines that had held similar hopes for months. The words felt hollow even as she wrote them, but Callie had learned that hope, however fragile, was sometimes the only thing standing between survival and surrender. Inside the trailer, she could hear her father's morning ritual beginning, the scrape of a beer bottle across the counter, the muttered curses at yesterday's racing forms, the inevitable slam of cabinet doors when reality crashed against his fantasies of easy money. Ralph Henderson had once been a man with calloused hands and steady work at the lumber mill. Now those same hands trembled as they reached for bottles that promised to wash away the weight of poor choices and mounting debts. The trailer park stretched before Callie like a patchwork, quilt of faded dreams. Mrs. Garcia hung laundry on a line strung between two posts, her weathered hands moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to find dignity in small tasks. 3 trailers down, old Mr. Peterson sat in his lawn chair, feeding scraps to a mangy cat that had adopted him the way strays often find each other in forgotten places. These people had become Callie's extended family by necessity rather than choice. They knew her father's struggles, had witnessed his gradual descent from occasional drinking to the kind of desperate behavior that made neighbors lock their doors and children walk different routes to school. Yet they also saw something in Callie that she struggled to see in herself, a resilience that bloomed despite the rocky soil of her circumstances. At Jefferson High School, 15 miles away, Callie existed in the spaces between social groups, too poor for the popular kids, too smart for the dropouts, too tired from working evenings at the truck stop diner to join clubs or sports teams. Her guidance counselor, Mrs. Patterson, had pulled her aside just last week. "You have potential, Callie," she had said, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. "Your grades are good despite everything. There are scholarships, programs that could help you get to college." College. The word felt as foreign to Callie as speaking a language she had only read about in books. Who would take care of her father? Who would make sure he remembered to eat something besides liquid calories? Who would hide the truck keys when his hands shook too badly to drive safely? The sound of gravel crunching under tires drew Callie's attention to the main road that curved past their section of the park. A blue pickup truck slowed as it approached, its engine running with the steady rumble that spoke of careful maintenance and patient hands. Behind the wheel sat Dean Hartwell, though Callie knew him only by reputation and the occasional glimpse at Morrison's Hardware when her father sent her to buy supplies they couldn't afford. Dean was one of those men who seemed carved from the same stone as the mountains that surrounded their valley. At 52, his brown hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and his face carried lines that spoke of both laughter and sorrow. He had moved to Pine Ridge 7 years ago, after his wife Sarah died of cancer, seeking the kind of solitude that only small towns could provide. Most people knew the basic facts of Dean's story: how he had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer, how he had met Sarah during his leave, and built a life that seemed as solid as the foundations he once laid for military outposts. They knew about his daughter Emma, a bright girl with her mother's laugh and her father's stubborn streak, who had been accepted to 3 different colleges before a drunk driver ran a red light on a rainy Thursday evening. What they didn't know were the details that haunted Dean's quiet moments. How Emma had called him just minutes before the accident, excited about a chemistry test she had aced. How he had been working late in his garage, half listening to her chatter about college applications and weekend plans, promising to call her back after he finished adjusting a carburetor. How that promise became another weight he would carry forever. The pickup truck disappeared around the bend, but its presence lingered in Callie's mind like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit the picture she understood of her world. Dean Hartwell kept to himself, ran his small auto repair business with quiet competence, and treated everyone with the kind of respectful politeness that suggested good manners learned in harder places. "Callie, get in here!" Her father's voice cut through her thoughts like a rusty blade. She closed her notebook carefully, tucking her pen between the pages where it wouldn't fall out, and stood to face whatever crisis awaited her inside. Ralph Henderson stood in the narrow kitchen, his face flushed with the mottled red that came from anger mixing with alcohol. In his hand, he held a crumpled piece of paper that Callie recognized with a sinking heart. Another bill they couldn't pay, another demand for money they didn't have. "Electricity's getting shut off tomorrow," he announced, waving the paper like evidence in a trial where they had already been found guilty. "Phone company's been calling all morning. And those—" He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more frightening than his shouts. "Those men from the casino are coming back tonight." Callie felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever the loan sharks entered their conversations. These weren't the kind of people who accepted payment plans or showed mercy for hardship stories. They were the kind of people who broke kneecaps as casually as most folks broke eggs for breakfast. "Maybe I can pick up extra shifts at the diner," Callie offered, though they both knew her part-time wages wouldn't make a dent in the kind of debt her father had accumulated. Mrs. Chen said she might need help with inventory on Sunday. "It's too late for that," Ralph interrupted, his voice carrying a finality that made Callie's stomach clench with dread. "Way too late." He moved to the window that looked out over the gravel road, his shoulders hunched as if carrying a weight that threatened to break him. For a moment, Callie saw not the man who had forgotten how to be a father, but the man who had once read her bedtime stories and taught her how to change a tire. The man who had held her when nightmares about her mother's death made sleep impossible. "There might be a way," he said quietly, still staring out the window. "Someone who might be willing to help us out of this mess." Something in his tone made Callie step backward, her body recognizing danger before her mind could process the words. "What do you mean?" Ralph turned to face her, and in his eyes, Callie saw something that chilled her more than any threat from loan sharks ever could. She saw calculation. She saw a man who had already made a decision that would change everything. "There's people who take care of girls like you," he said, his voice barely audible. "People who provide opportunities for young women who don't have many options." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire that was already spreading, consuming everything in its path. Callie understood what he meant without needing further explanation. She had heard whispers at school, seen news stories about girls who disappeared into situations that started with promises of better lives and ended in places where hope went to die. "Dad, no." The words came out as a whisper, then stronger as the full horror of his suggestion settled into her mind. "No, you can't, you wouldn't." But even as she said it, Callie could see in his face that he would. That somewhere in the twisted logic of desperation and debt, he had convinced himself that selling his daughter was a solution rather than the ultimate betrayal. It's not like that, Ralph said quickly, his words stumbling over each other in their rush to justify the unjustifiable. These are decent people. They'll take care of you, give you opportunities I never could. You'll have nice clothes, good food. Stop. Callie's voice cut through his rationalizations like a knife through paper. Just stop talking. She backed toward the door, her hand fumbling for the handle while her eyes stayed locked on her father's face, memorizing the moment when the last bridge between them burned completely. Outside, she could hear Mrs. Garcia calling her grandchildren in for lunch, the sound of normal life continuing while Callie's world cracked apart like ice under too much weight. "I have to go to work," she managed to say, though the words felt like they were coming from someone else's mouth. "My shift starts in an hour." Callie, wait, but she was already through the door, running toward the main road with her notebook clutched against her chest, like armor that might protect her from the truth of what her father had become. Behind her, she could hear him calling her name, but the sound faded as distance and determination carried her away from the only home she had ever known. As she reached the bus stop that would take her to the truck stop diner, Callie didn't notice the blue pickup truck parked at Morrison's Hardware, or the man inside who watched her pass with eyes that recognized the particular kind of desperation that came from having nowhere left to run. Dean Hartwell had seen that look before, in the faces of soldiers who had pushed beyond their limits, in the eyes of his own daughter during her mother's final illness, and in his own reflection during the months after Emma's funeral when breathing felt like work and tomorrow seemed like a burden rather than a promise. He didn't know yet what role he was about to play in Callie Henderson's story. He only knew that some kinds of pain called out to others who had walked similar paths, and that sometimes the most unlikely people became bridges to safety when all other roads led to darkness. The afternoon stretched ahead like a question mark, waiting for events to provide the answer that would change two lives in ways neither of them could yet imagine. The blood-stained $20 bills lay crumpled on the bar at Murphy's Tavern like evidence of a crime that hadn't happened yet. Ralph Henderson stared at them with the hollow eyes of a man who had run out of choices, while across from him sat two men whose presence turned the familiar warmth of the neighborhood bar into something cold and threatening. Vincent Vinny. Torino adjusted his expensive watch with the casual precision of someone who measured time in dollars and pain. His companion, a mountain of a man everyone called Bear, said nothing but cracked his knuckles with the sound of kindling snapping in a fire. These weren't the kind of men who belonged in Pine Ridge's only bar, but debt had a way of bringing unwelcome visitors to even the quietest corners of the world. 15,000, Vinny repeated, his voice carrying the flat tone of someone stating an undeniable fact. "That's what you owe, Ralph. 15,000 plus the juice that's been running for 3 months. Ralph's hands trembled as he reached for his beer, the bottle slipping slightly before he managed to grip it properly. The bar felt smaller with these men in it, the familiar faces of his neighbors suddenly seeming very far away, despite sitting just a few stools down. "I told you I'm good for it," Ralph said, his voice carrying none of the confidence his words suggested. "The unemployment check comes next week, and I've got some possibilities lined up." "Possibilities don't pay debts," Bear rumbled, speaking for the first time since they had arrived. His voice sounded like gravel being churned in a cement mixer. "Money pays debts." Murphy, the bar's owner and a man who had seen enough of life to know when to mind his own business, found sudden interest in cleaning glasses at the far end of the bar. The other patrons seemed to develop similar selective blindness, their conversations becoming more focused on their drinks and less on the drama unfolding 3 seats away. Vinny leaned forward, his cologne mixing unpleasantly with the bar's familiar sense of beer and fried food. "Here's the thing, Ralph. My patience isn't unlimited, and neither is my boss's. We need to see some kind of good faith gesture by tomorrow night, or this conversation gets a lot less friendly." "What kind of gesture?" Ralph asked, though something in his tone suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't be something he wanted to hear. "Something valuable," Vinny said, his eyes taking on a predatory gleam. Something that shows you understand the seriousness of your situation. It was then that Bear spoke again, his words falling into the conversation like stones into still water. "Heard you got a daughter." The temperature in the bar seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ralph's beer bottle stopped halfway to his lips, suspended in air like his breath, like his ability to think clearly. Around them, the normal sounds of the bar continued, the clink of pool balls, the low murmur of conversation, the hiss of beer being poured. But for Ralph, everything had narrowed to this moment, these words, this terrible suggestion that hung in the air like smoke. "She's just a kid," Ralph whispered, his voice barely audible over the jukebox playing an old country song about mistakes and regret. "Kid's 16, Vinny said, consulting his phone as if reading from a file. "That's not a kid anymore in some places. That's a young woman with potential." The word potential carried weight that made Ralph's stomach clench with understanding. He had heard whispers, rumors about girls who disappeared from small towns and ended up in situations that no father should ever imagine for his daughter. But those were stories about other people, other families, other kinds of desperation. "I can't," Ralph said, but even as the words left his mouth, he could feel his resolve cracking like ice under pressure. "She's all I've got left. Then maybe you should have thought about that before you decided our money was yours to gamble with," Bear said, his massive hand closing around his beer bottle in a way that suggested it might not be the only thing he could crush without effort. Vinny reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, placing it on the bar next to the crumpled bills. The card was plain white with only a phone number printed in black ink, but Ralph stared at it as if it were a death warrant. 24 hours, Vinny said, standing and adjusting his jacket. "Call that number. Arrange the meeting, and your debt gets significantly reduced. Or don't call, and Bear and I come visit you at that trailer park, where everyone will get to watch what happens to people who don't honor their obligations." They left as quietly as they had arrived. But their presence lingered in the bar like the memory of a nightmare that follows you into waking hours. Ralph sat alone with the business card and his thoughts, neither of which offered any comfort. 3 hours later, Dean Hartwell pushed through the same doors, seeking nothing more complicated than a quiet beer and an hour away from the memories that always seemed loudest in his empty house. He had spent the day working on Mrs. Chen's delivery truck, losing himself in the familiar rhythm of diagnosis and repair that had become his meditation in the years since Emma's death. Dean noticed Ralph immediately, not because he was looking for him, but because desperation has a particular smell that men who have seen combat learn to recognize. Ralph sat hunched over his drink like a question mark, his shoulders curved inward as if trying to protect himself from invisible blows. "Evening, Ralph," Dean said, taking the stool 2 seats away. Close enough to be neighborly, far enough to respect a man's right to drink alone with his troubles. Ralph looked up with eyes that seemed to focus with effort. "Dean, didn't see you come in. Just got here." Dean ordered a beer from Murphy, who served it with the practiced silence of a man who understood that sometimes conversation was the last thing a customer wanted. "Long day?" "You could say that." Ralph's laugh carried no humor, only the bitter sound of a man who had discovered that rock bottom had a basement. "Dean, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. You ever been in a situation where all your choices were bad ones?" Dean considered the question while taking a slow sip of his beer. He thought about Emma, about the night she died, about the choices he had made and the ones he hadn't, about Sarah's illness and the helpless rage of watching someone you'd love fade away despite every prayer and every treatment and every desperate bargain with God. "Yeah," he said finally. "I have. What did you do?" "I tried to find the choice that would let me live with myself afterward." Ralph nodded, as if this answer contained some wisdom he desperately needed. They sat in silence for several minutes, 2 men separated by circumstance, but united in the understanding that life sometimes presented problems that had no good solutions. "Dean," Ralph said finally, his voice so quiet that Dean had to lean closer to hear him. If something happened to me, if I couldn't take care of Callie anymore, would you keep an eye on her? Make sure she was okay? The question hit Dean like a physical blow. He thought about Callie Henderson, the quiet girl he had seen waiting for the bus, carrying herself with the careful dignity of someone who had learned not to expect much from the world. He thought about Emma, about how fiercely he had loved his daughter, and how that love had survived even her death. "Ralph, what's going on?" Dean asked, setting down his beer and turning to face the other man fully. "What kind of trouble are you in?" But Ralph was already standing, dropping money on the bar, with hands that shook like leaves in a storm. "Just promise me," he said, his voice breaking. "Promise me you'll look out for her." "I promise," Dean said, the words coming out before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. "But Ralph, thank you." Ralph grabbed the business card from the bar and headed for the door, leaving Dean alone with questions that multiplied like shadows as the sun went down. Murphy approached with a fresh beer Dean hadn't ordered. "That one's been coming in here for months, drowning his troubles instead of facing them," the bartender said quietly. "Heard he owes money to some very unforgiving people." "What kind of money?" "The kind that gets collected one way or another." Dean stared at the door where Ralph had disappeared, understanding beginning to settle in his mind like sediment in still water. He thought about Emma, about the promise he had made to a dying man, about the responsibility that came with being someone others turned to in their darkest moments. Outside, the October wind carried the smell of coming winter, of endings and new beginnings, of choices that would echo through the years like stones thrown into deep water. Dean finished his beer in silence, knowing that tomorrow would bring consequences he couldn't yet imagine, but feeling for the first time in 3 years that his life might have purpose beyond simply getting through each day. The business card Ralph had taken contained a phone number that would change everything, but it was Dean's promise, made in a moment of compassion to a desperate father, that would determine whether that change led to salvation or something far worse. In 12 hours, a transaction would take place that would shock a small town and test the boundaries of what one man would do to honor a promise made to the dead and keep faith with the living. Callie's mother's locket felt warm against her chest as she lay awake in the narrow bed that had been hers for as long as she could remember. The small gold heart contained the only photograph she had of Maria Henderson, a woman whose smile suggested she had believed in happy endings before life taught her otherwise. Through the thin walls of the trailer, Callie could hear her father pacing the kitchen floor, his footsteps irregular and anxious, punctuated by the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing as if he were searching for something that wasn't there. She had pretended to be asleep when he came home from Murphy's, had listened through her bedroom door as he made a phone call that lasted less than 2 minutes, but seemed to drain all the air from their small home. His voice had been different, smaller somehow, as if the words themselves were stealing pieces of his soul with each syllable. "Tomorrow night," he had said into the phone. "Yes, I understand the terms." Now, as dawn crept through her window with the reluctant light of autumn, Callie pressed her hand against the locket and tried to remember her mother's voice. Maria had died when Callie was 8, a victim of the same cancer that seemed to hunt through their family tree like a persistent predator. Before the illness, before the medical bills that started their slide toward poverty, before her father discovered that beer could temporarily silence the voice of grief. Their family had been different. "She used to sing to me," Callie whispered to the photograph hidden inside the locket, her voice barely audible in the morning quiet. "Lullabies in Spanish that her grandmother taught her. She said they were magic songs, that they could protect me from bad dreams." The protection hadn't worked. The bad dreams had come anyway, but now they wore the faces of men who saw children as commodities and fathers who had forgotten how to be protectors. A soft knock on her bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Callie, you awake, honey?" Her father's voice carried a forced gentleness that made her stomach clench with dread. She had heard that tone before, The same careful kindness he had used when explaining that her mother wouldn't be coming home from the hospital. The same false brightness he had employed when telling her they would have to sell their house and move to the trailer park. "I'm up," she called back, sitting up in bed and pulling her blanket around her shoulders like armor. Ralph opened the door slowly, as if afraid of what he might find on the other side. He looked older than his 43 years, his face carrying lines that grief and guilt had carved with patient persistence. In his hands he held a cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. Real coffee, not the instant kind they usually drank, which told Callie this conversation was going to be worse than she had imagined. "I brought you coffee," he said, settling carefully on the edge of her bed, as if the mattress might break under the weight of what he had come to say. "Added some of that powdered creamer you like." Callie accepted the cup with hands that remained steady despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. The coffee was too hot and too sweet, but she sipped it anyway, using the familiar ritual to buy time before the words that would change everything. "Dad," she said quietly, "what did you do?" Ralph's face crumpled like paper in a fire. For a moment, Callie saw him as he must have been at her age, uncertain, frightened, trying to navigate a world that seemed determined to punish good intentions with impossible choices. "There are some people coming tonight," he said finally. "People who can give you opportunities I never could. A chance at a better life." "What kind of people?" "Decent people. Successful people. They'll take care of you. Make sure you have everything you need." The words fell between them like stones into still water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of their small world. Callie set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, her mind working through the implications of what her father was too cowardly to say directly. "You're selling me," she said, her voice carrying the flat certainty of someone stating an undeniable fact. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like, Dad?" "Because it sounds exactly like that." Ralph stood abruptly, moving to the window that looked out over the trailer park. In the distance, Callie could see Mrs. Garcia hanging laundry on the line, her movements efficient and purposeful, the actions of someone who had learned to find dignity in small tasks and meaning in everyday routines. "I owe money," Ralph said to the window, his reflection wavering in the glass like a ghost of the man he used to be. "More money than I'll ever be able to pay back. These people, they don't negotiate payment plans. They don't accept excuses. They collect what they're owed one way or another. So you decided to pay them with me. I decided to find you a way out of this mess before it gets worse." Callie laughed, but the sound carried no humor, only the bitter recognition of a lie wrapped in the language of sacrifice. "A way out for who, Dad? For me or for you?" The question hung in the air, like smoke from a fire that had already consumed everything valuable. Ralph turned from the window to face his daughter, and in his eyes, Callie saw the truth he couldn't speak, that somewhere in the mathematics of desperation, he had calculated that her suffering was worth less than his safety. "The people coming tonight," Ralph continued as if she hadn't spoken, "they're not what you think. They run legitimate businesses, provide services for wealthy clients. You'll have nice clothes, good food, maybe even get to travel. What kind of services? Companionship, entertainment, nothing you can't handle." The euphemisms fell from his lips like drops of poison, each word a small betrayal that added to the growing distance between the father she had once trusted and the stranger who now stood in her bedroom selling her future to pay for his mistakes. "I want to see Mom's grave," Callie said suddenly, the words surprising her as much as they seemed to surprise Ralph. "Before tonight, I want to say goodbye." Ralph's face softened with something that might have been relief, gratitude that she wasn't fighting him, wasn't making this harder than it already was. He didn't understand that her compliance came not from acceptance, but from the need to hold something sacred close to her heart before everything familiar was stripped away. "Of course," he said quickly. "We can drive out there this afternoon. Take some flowers, spend some time. I'd like to go alone." "Callie, I don't think—" "Please." The word carried weight that surprised them both. "Let me have that much." Ralph nodded slowly. understanding that this small request was both a gift to his daughter and a kindness to himself. A few hours when he wouldn't have to see the knowledge in her eyes or face the magnitude of what he was about to do. After he left her room, Callie sat in the growing morning light and tried to memorize everything about this moment, the way the sun slanted through her window, the familiar sounds of the trailer park coming to life, the weight of her mother's locket against her chest. Tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow, would bring different windows, different sounds, different weights to carry. She dressed carefully in her best clothes, a blue dress her mother had bought her 2 years ago that was now too tight in some places and too loose in others, testament to how much she had changed while the rest of her world remained stubbornly the same. The locket went beneath the dress, hidden against her heart, where no one could see it or take it away. Outside, the October air carried the scent of leaves beginning their final transformation, of endings that made way for new beginnings. Callie walked to the bus stop with her notebook tucked under her arm, intending to catch the early bus to town, and then transfer to the line that would take her to Restwood Cemetery. She didn't notice the blue pickup truck that had been parked across from the trailer park since dawn, or the man inside who watched her pass with eyes that had spent the night wrestling with promises made to desperate fathers and obligations to daughters, both living and dead. Dean Hartwell had not slept. He had spent the dark hours thinking about Emma, about Ralph's strange request, about the business card and the men who carried them. He had made phone calls to people who owed him favors from his military days, people who could provide information about debts and the methods used to collect them. What he had learned made him understand that time was running out for Callie Henderson, and that sometimes the best way to honor a promise to a desperate father was to disobey him completely. As Callie's bus disappeared around the curve that led toward town, Dean started his engine and began following a route that would take him to places where desperate men made deals with devils, and where the only way to save someone was to become the thing everyone would assume you were anyway. The day stretched ahead like a bridge over dark water, and by the time the sun set, everything would be different. Dean's purple heart lay wrapped in tissue paper at the bottom of his bedroom drawer. Beneath photographs and letters he couldn't bring himself to look at, but couldn't bear to throw away. The medal had been presented to him after an IED explosion outside Kandahar, left him with a limp he still carried, and scars that had faded but never quite disappeared. He hadn't looked at it in 3 years, but this morning he held it in his calloused hands like a reminder of who he used to be before grief. He taught him that survival and living weren't the same thing. The medal represented a time when his purpose was clear, when protecting people was his mission rather than his burden. In Afghanistan, the enemy wore different clothes and spoke different languages, but the stakes were the same: good people caught in impossible situations. Depending on someone else's courage to see another sunrise, Dean closed the drawer and checked his watch. 3 o'clock. Ralph had called an hour ago, his voice shaking as he provided an address and a time: 7 o'clock at the abandoned gas station on Route 9, the same place where teenagers bought beer from adults who had forgotten the difference between harmless rebellion and genuine harm. The transaction was simple on its surface. Dean would arrive with $5,000, money he had withdrawn from the account that contained Emma's college fund, savings that had outlived their purpose but found new meaning in this moment. Ralph would bring Callie. The men who owned Ralph's debt would facilitate the transfer and consider a portion of what they were owed to be paid in full. Everyone involved understood the surface narrative: a middle-aged man with money and appetites, a desperate father selling what he couldn't afford to keep, a vulnerable girl becoming a commodity in an economy that traded human dignity like baseball cards. What none of them understood was that Dean had spent the last 12 hours constructing a different kind of transaction entirely: the phone call to his old unit. Commander had been brief but productive. "I need information about a debt collection operation in Pine Ridge," Dean had said, and within 2 hours he had names, addresses, and operational details about Vincent Torino's business model that would have impressed military intelligence analysts. The call to his sister Margaret had been harder. "I'm going to do something tonight that might make me look like someone I'm not," he had told her. "If things go badly, if you hear stories about me that don't make sense, I need you to remember who I really am." Margaret, a nurse who had seen enough of human nature to understand that good people sometimes had to do questionable things for the right reasons, had asked only one question. "Are you saving someone?" "I'm trying to." "Then do what you have to do and let God sort out the rest." Now, as evening approached with the steady inevitability of a train schedule, Dean prepared for the most important mission of his civilian life. He dressed in dark clothes that wouldn't show stains, checked the Glock 19 he had carried in Afghanistan and legally owned in Montana, and reviewed the plan he had constructed with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in places where mistakes were measured in body counts. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. He would play the role everyone expected him to play, the predator with money and appetites. He would complete the transaction, take custody of Callie, and disappear into a carefully prepared safe house until he could arrange something more permanent. The legal complications would come later, handled by lawyers who specialized in cases involving human trafficking and parental rights. The social complications would last longer, handled by time and truth and the gradual understanding that sometimes salvation wore disguises that made good people look like monsters. At 6:30, Dean parked his truck behind Morrison's Hardware and walked 3 blocks to where he had positioned a stolen motorcycle earlier in the day. The bike was registered to someone who didn't exist, purchased with cash from someone who didn't ask questions, and would disappear into a lake before midnight if everything went according to plan. The abandoned gas station sat like a tombstone beside Route 9. Its broken windows and graffiti-covered walls, testament to economic dreams that had died slow deaths. In the gathering dusk, it looked like the kind of place where bad things happened to people who had run out of other options. Ralph's car was already there, parked behind the building, where it couldn't be seen from the road. Through the cracked windshield, Dean could see 2 figures, a man hunched over the steering wheel like a question mark, and a girl sitting perfectly still in the passenger seat as if movement might shatter whatever. Fragile control she had constructed around her fear. Dean parked the motorcycle beside a cluster of rusted oil drums and walked toward the building with the confident stride of someone who belonged in places like this. His hand rested casually near the pistol concealed beneath his jacket, and his eyes swept the perimeter with the automatic awareness of someone who had learned to expect trouble from every shadow. Vincent Torino emerged from the gas station's office like a spider from its web, his expensive suit incongruous against the building's decay. Bear followed behind him, his massive frame filling the doorway completely before he stepped into the fading light. "Mr. Hartwell," Vinny said, extending a hand that Dean shook with the firm grip of someone establishing dominance without making it obvious. "Punctual. I like that in a business partner. I believe in honoring agreements," Dean replied, his voice carrying the flat professionalism he had once used to discuss targets and extraction routes with men who measured success in missions completed rather than lives saved. "Excellent. Shall we proceed with the transaction?" Dean nodded, and Vinny gestured toward Ralph's car with the casual authority of someone conducting a routine business deal. Ralph emerged from the driver's side like a man walking to his own execution, his face pale and his hands trembling as he opened the passenger door. Callie stepped out of the car with a dignity that broke Dean's heart. She had dressed carefully for this moment, wearing a blue dress that spoke of pride maintained despite circumstances, and she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone who refused to let fear show even when terror lived in every breath. Her eyes met Dean's across the broken asphalt, and in that moment he saw something that made his chest tighten with recognition. She wasn't looking at him with the resignation of a victim accepting her fate. She was studying him with the careful assessment of someone trying to determine whether he might be different from what he appeared to be. "This is Callie," Ralph said, his voice barely audible. "She's a good girl, smart. She won't cause any trouble." Dean approached slowly, understanding that every step, every gesture, every word would be remembered by all of them for the rest of their lives. When he reached Callie, he extended his hand with the same respect he would show to any person whose dignity deserved recognition. "Miss Henderson," he said quietly. "My name is Dean Hartwell." Callie shook his hand with a grip that was firm despite the tremor he could feel beneath her composure. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the strength that had carried her through 16 years of disappointment and neglect, and the courage that had brought her to this moment without breaking. "Mr. Hartwell," she replied, her voice steady. "I suppose you're my new owner." The word owner fell between them like a stone into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Dean heard Vinny's quiet chuckle, Ralph's sharp intake of breath, and the sound of his own heart breaking for a girl who had learned to name ugly truths with unflinching honesty. "Nobody owns anybody else," Dean said, his voice carrying a conviction that made Vinny's smile falter slightly. "But I am going to take care of you." He reached into his jacket and withdrew an envelope containing $5,000 in cash, money that represented Emma's college dreams, transformed into Callie's chance at a different kind of education. Vinny accepted the envelope with the practiced ease of someone who had conducted similar transactions. But Dean noticed that his eyes never left Dean's face, as if trying to read a story that didn't match the obvious narrative. "Pleasure doing business with you," Vinny said, tucking the envelope into his inside pocket. "I trust you'll find the merchandise satisfactory." Dean's hand moved toward his concealed weapon, but Callie's touch on his arm stopped him. She had seen the flash of violence in his eyes, had recognized the moment when pretense might give way to something more honest and infinitely more dangerous. "It's okay," she said quietly, her words meant for him alone. "I'm ready to go." Dean nodded, understanding that her courage in this moment was greater than any he had shown on foreign battlefields. He placed his hand gently on her shoulder, a gesture that looked possessive to the watching men but felt protective to the girl who had learned to recognize the difference. "We're leaving now," Dean announced, his voice carrying the finality of someone who was done playing roles and ready to begin the real work of salvation. As they walked toward the motorcycle, Dean could feel the weight of watching eyes and whispered conversations. Tomorrow, the story would spread through Pine Ridge like wildfire, the story of a desperate father, a vulnerable girl, and a man who had bought what shouldn't have been for sale. But tonight, as Callie climbed onto the back of the motorcycle and wrapped her arms around his waist with the trust of someone who had no other choices left, Dean felt something he hadn't experienced since Emma's death, the sense that his life might have purpose beyond simply enduring each day until the next one arrived. The motorcycle engine roared to life, drowning out the sound of Ralph's sobbing and Vinny's laughter. As they rode into the Montana darkness, Dean carried with him the weight of a promise kept and a mission begun. The mission of teaching a girl who had been sold that she was worth saving, and proving to a community that sometimes the most unlikely heroes wore the faces of villains until the truth had time to reveal itself. The handmade quilt that covered Dean's spare bed had been Sarah's final project during her last months of chemotherapy. When her hands needed something to do while her body fought a war it couldn't win. Each square told a story. Emma's baby clothes transformed into memory. Fabric from Sarah's wedding dress woven together with pieces of Dean's old uniforms, creating a tapestry of love that had outlasted the woman who stitched it together with hope and determination. Now, as dawn crept through the windows of Dean's modest farmhouse, the quilt covered Callie Henderson, who lay awake in the growing light trying to understand how the worst night of her life had somehow transported her to a place that felt safer than anywhere she had been in years. The house was quiet in the way that spoke of careful habits and deliberate solitude. No sounds of bottles clinking against counters, No muttered curses or slamming doors, just the peaceful silence of a man who had learned to live with loss without letting it poison everything around him. Callie had barely slept, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening with the obsessive attention to detail that trauma demands. The ride on the motorcycle through the Montana darkness, her arms wrapped around a stranger who had paid money for her, but somehow felt more trustworthy than the father who had sold her. The arrival at this house that looked like something from a different world, paint that wasn't peeling, windows that weren't cracked, a front porch that suggested people who sat in the evening air and found peace in simple moments. "You can have the spare room," Dean had said when they arrived, his voice carrying the careful politeness of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. "There's a lock on the door that works from the inside. Use it if it makes you feel safer." He had shown her where to find towels and toothbrushes, had pointed out the phone in the kitchen and the closest neighbors' houses, had given her information that suggested escape routes rather than imprisonment. Then he had disappeared into his own room, leaving her alone with questions that multiplied in the darkness like shadows cast by a flickering candle. Now, as sunlight painted the spare room in shades of gold and possibility, Callie examined her surroundings with the careful attention of someone trying to determine whether yesterday's nightmare had truly ended or simply changed costume. The room was simple, but clean, furnished with pieces that spoke of function rather than fashion. A dresser that had been painted white to cover years of use. A mirror with a frame that had been repaired rather than replaced. A small bookshelf filled with novels that someone had actually read, their spines creased from handling rather than pristine from display. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph that made Callie's breath catch in her throat. A teenage girl with dark hair and laughing eyes, wearing a high school graduation cap and gown, her arm around a man who looked like a younger version of Dean. The girl, Emma, it had to be Emma, radiated the confident joy of someone who believed the future held nothing but promise. Soft footsteps in the hallway announced Dean's approach, followed by a gentle knock on the door. "Callie, are you awake?" "Yes," she called back, pulling the quilt around her shoulders like armor against whatever came next. "I made coffee and breakfast." "Whenever you're ready." His footsteps retreated, giving her space to process this simple offer of normalcy. When was the last time someone had made her breakfast without expecting something in return? When was the last time someone had knocked on her door instead of barging through it uninvited? Callie dressed in yesterday's clothes, the blue dress that had carried her through the transaction, now wrinkled but still her best option, and ventured into the hallway that led toward the scent of bacon and coffee. The house revealed itself in glimpses as she walked. Photographs of Dean in military uniform, standing beside men who wore the same expression of determined competence. Diplomas and certificates that spoke of education continued beyond high school. Tools arranged with the precision of someone who understood that proper maintenance prevented future problems. The kitchen was the heart of the house, painted in warm yellows that caught the morning light and threw it back in gentle waves. Dean stood at the stove, his back to her, turning bacon with the careful attention of someone who had learned to find meditation in simple tasks. He had changed from last night's dark clothing into jeans and a flannel shirt. That made him look less like the predator everyone assumed him to be, and more like the man she was beginning to suspect. He actually was. "Coffee's fresh," he said without turning around, as if sensing her presence in the doorway. "Cream and sugar are on the table." Callie poured herself a cup, adding cream until the coffee turned the color of caramel, and sat at the kitchen table that bore the scars of years of use. Through the window, she could see a view that belonged in a different world than the one she had left behind. Rolling fields that stretched toward mountains, painted purple by distance. Horses grazing in a pasture that spoke of peace rather than poverty. "This is beautiful," she said, surprised by the sound of her own voice speaking words that weren't carefully calculated for safety. Dean turned from the stove, carrying 2 plates filled with eggs, bacon, and toast cut into triangles the way parents do for children they want to protect. Sarah always said it was the view that made her fall in love with this place. Sarah was your wife over 22 years. Dean set a plate in front of her and took the chair across the table, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid crowding. She died 3 years ago. Cancer. I'm sorry, thank you. Dean cut his eggs with precise movements, his attention focused on his plate rather than her face. Emma was our daughter. She would have been 19 this month. The words settled between them like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that touched every corner of their shared silence. Callie studied Dean's face, seeing for the first time the careful way he held his grief, not hidden, but contained, like something too precious to display carelessly. "Is that why you helped me?" she asked, her voice gentle with the recognition of pain that called to pain across the spaces between strangers. Dean looked up from his plate, meeting her eyes with the direct honesty of someone who had learned that truth, however difficult, was always preferable to comfortable lies. "Partly. Your father asked me to look out for you, and I made him a promise. But yes, when I saw what was happening, when I understood what those men intended," he paused, setting down his fork as if the weight of memory made even simple actions difficult. "I couldn't save Emma from the drunk driver who killed her. But I could save you from the men who wanted to buy you, so you bought me instead. I paid money to get you away from them. There's a difference." Callie considered this distinction while taking a bite of eggs that tasted better than anything she had eaten in months. Real butter, fresh herbs, the kind of careful preparation that spoke of someone who understood that cooking could be an act of love even when no one was watching. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now we figure out what comes next. Together." The word together carried weight that surprised them both. Dean had spent 3 years learning to live in solitude, finding purpose in work and routine, but never in connection. Callie had spent 16 years learning not to depend on others, protecting herself from disappointment by expecting nothing and receiving exactly what she anticipated. "I should probably go back to school," Callie said, testing the idea like someone stepping onto ice that might not hold her weight. "I was supposed to graduate this year. Jefferson High." "Yes, though I suppose everyone will have heard by now." "About last night," Dean nodded, understanding the complexity of small-town gossip and the way stories grew in the telling until truth became buried under layers of assumption and speculation. By now, half of Pine Ridge would know that Dean Hartwell had paid money for Ralph Henderson's daughter, and most of them would believe they understood exactly what that transaction meant. "People are going to think terrible things about you," Callie continued, her voice carrying the guilt of someone who understood that her rescue had come at the cost of his reputation. "About both of us. Let them think what they want. The truth has a way of working itself out over time. What if it doesn't? What if they never understand?" Dean stood and moved to the window that looked out over his land, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of military training that had become second nature. "Callie, I've learned that you can't control what other people think or say about you. You can only control what you do and why you do it. I did what I did because it was right, not because it would be popular, even if it costs you everything. Everything I cared about was already gone. Until last night." The words hung in the air, like a bridge being built between two people who had learned to live with loss, but were discovering they might not have to live with loneliness. Callie felt something shifting inside her chest, not the fluttery feeling of romantic attraction, but something deeper and more fundamental. The recognition of safety, the possibility of trust. "Dean," she said quietly, "I need you to know something. Whatever people think about what you bought last night, I want you to know that you didn't buy a victim. You bought someone who's going to fight to deserve the chance you gave her." Dean turned from the window, and for the first time since she had met him, Callie saw him smile, not the careful expression of someone managing a difficult situation, but the genuine warmth of someone who had just received an unexpected gift. "I never doubted that for a second," he said. Outside, the October morning continued its gentle progression toward noon, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility. In the distance, Callie could see a school bus making its way along the rural route that would take Pine Ridge's children to Jefferson High, where her empty desk would raise questions, and her absence would feed the gossip that was already spreading through the community like wildfire. Tomorrow, she would have to face those questions and that gossip. Tomorrow, she would have to walk through hallways where everyone knew her story, but no one understood the truth of what had really happened in that abandoned gas station. But today, she sat in a kitchen filled with morning light, eating breakfast prepared by a man who had chosen to see her worth when no one else had bothered to look. Today, she wore a quilt made by a woman who had believed in love lasting beyond death, and she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that her future might contain more hope than fear. The quilt would stay on her bed for as long as she remained in this house, a reminder that sometimes the most precious gifts come from people we never get the chance to thank, and that love, once given freely, continues to provide warmth long after the giver has gone. The repair manual for 1967 Mustangs lay open on Dean's workbench like a map to buried treasure, its pages stained with decades of oil and marked with handwritten notes from previous owners who had loved cars enough to document every bolt and gasket. Dean believed that everything broken could be fixed with enough patience and the right tools, whether it was a seized engine or a 16-year-old girl who had learned not to trust adults who claimed they wanted to help. 2 weeks had passed since the night at the abandoned gas station. 2 weeks during which Callie had settled into the rhythms of Dean's household with the careful grace of someone testing the strength of ice before committing her full weight. She helped with breakfast, learned to operate the washing machine, and discovered that Dean's garage contained enough projects to keep curious hands busy for months. "Hand me that socket wrench," Dean said, his voice muffled by the hood of Mrs. Patterson's Honda Civic. The guidance counselor had brought her car to Dean after the dealership quoted her a repair estimate that would have required a second mortgage. The 3/8 one, Callie, selected the correct tool from the organized chaos of Dean's workbench and passed it to him with the efficiency of someone who had been learning the names and purposes of automotive tools with the dedication of a scholar studying a foreign language. "What's wrong with it?" she asked, wiping her hands on the shop rag Dean had given her when she started helping him with repairs. "Alternator's going bad. See how the belt's been slipping?" That's what caused the squealing noise she was hearing. Dean emerged from under the hood, his face streaked with grease and his hair slightly disheveled, in a way that made him look younger than his 52 years. Over the past 2 weeks, Callie had watched him work on a dozen different vehicles, each one presenting a unique puzzle that he approached with the methodical patience of someone who understood that rushing led to mistakes and mistakes led to problems that were harder to fix than the original issue. "Can you teach me to do that?" she asked, nodding toward the engine compartment where Dean had been working. "Change an alternator? Sure. It's not complicated once you understand how the charging system works. No, I mean all of it. Everything you know about fixing cars." Dean paused in his cleaning of the socket wrench, studying Callie's face with the careful attention he gave to diagnostic problems that required more than surface-level analysis. "That's a lot to learn. Takes years to really understand automotive systems. I have time." The simple statement carried weight that surprised them both. 2 weeks ago, Callie's future had been measured in hours rather than years, her timeline controlled by men who saw her as a commodity with a limited shelf life. Now she spoke of years as if they belonged to her, as if the future was something she could plan rather than something that would happen to her regardless of her wishes. "All right," Dean said, setting down the wrench and moving to a filing cabinet where he kept technical manuals organized with military precision. "But we start with basics. Theory before practice. Understanding why things work before you. Learn to fix them when they don't." He pulled out a thick manual titled Automotive Fundamentals and handed it to Callie with the solemnity of someone passing down family treasures. "Start with Chapter 1. Read it, understand it, then come find me with questions." Callie accepted the manual with reverence, understanding that Dean was offering her something more valuable than automotive knowledge. He was giving her the tools to build a different kind of future, one where she would depend on her own skills rather than the goodwill of others. "Dean," she said, clutching the manual against her chest, "why are you doing this, really?" Dean wiped his hands on a shop rag, taking time to consider his answer with the care of someone who had learned that words, once spoken, could never be taken back. "Because everyone deserves to know they're capable of more than they've been told. Because you remind me that teaching someone to fix things can be more important than fixing things yourself." The sound of tires on gravel interrupted their conversation, announcing the arrival of a visitor who would test the fragile piece they had constructed over the past 2 weeks. Through the garage's open door, they could see Ralph Henderson's battered sedan pulling into the driveway, its engine running rough and its exhaust pipe trailing smoke that spoke of problems Dean could diagnose from 50 yards away. Ralph emerged from the car like a man walking to his own trial, his clothes rumpled and his face carrying the grey pallor of someone who had been living on regret and cheap whiskey. He moved toward the garage with uncertain steps, his eyes focused on Callie, with an intensity that made her step backward instinctively. "Hello, sweetheart," Ralph said, his voice carrying forced cheer that fooled no one. "You look good, healthy." Callie said nothing, her body language shifting into the defensive posture she had perfected during years of navigating her father's unpredictable moods. Dean moved closer to her, not protectively aggressive, but quietly supportive, his presence a reminder that she no longer had to face difficult conversations alone. "What do you want, Ralph?" Dean asked, his voice carrying the flat professionalism he had once used to address subordinates who had disappointed him. "I want to talk to my daughter." "That a crime?" "Not a crime, but not necessarily welcome either." Ralph's face flushed with anger that was mostly directed at himself, but had nowhere else to go. "She's still my kid, Hartwell. Blood's thicker than whatever arrangement you two have worked out. Blood didn't stop you from selling her to pay your gambling debts." The words hit Ralph like physical blows, causing him to stagger slightly before steadying himself against the workbench. Around them, the garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson's Honda cooling down and the whisper of autumn wind through the open doors. "I made a mistake," Ralph said finally, his voice barely audible. "I was desperate, scared. Those men, you don't know what they're capable of." "I know exactly what they're capable of," Dean replied. "That's why I made sure Callie wouldn't find out firsthand." Ralph turned his attention back to Callie, his eyes pleading for forgiveness that she wasn't sure she was ready to give. "Callie, honey, I'm getting help." "Going to meetings. Things are going to be different. I've heard that before," Callie said quietly. "Every time you got in trouble, every time you promised to change." "How is this different?" "Because this time I lost you. This time the consequences are permanent. The consequences were always permanent. You just didn't notice them before." Ralph flinched as if she had struck him, understanding for perhaps the first time that his daughter had been paying the price for his choices long before he decided to make her payment literal. "I want you to come home," he said desperately. "I've been sober for 10 days. The trailer's clean. I threw out all the bottles, changed the locks so those men can't get in. We can start over." Callie looked around the garage, where she had spent the morning learning about alternators and the future, where she had discovered that adults could keep promises and that her opinion mattered in decisions about her own life. Then she looked at her father, seeing not the monster she had expected, to become but the broken man he had always been. Someone who loved her in the only way he knew how, but had never learned to make love stronger than fear. "I'm not coming home," she said, her voice steady, despite the earthquake happening inside her chest. "This is home now. You can't be serious. He's not family. He's just some guy who paid money for you. He's more of a father than you've been in years." The words fell between them like stones into deep water, creating ripples that would reach every corner of their relationship for years to come. Ralph's face crumpled with the understanding that he had lost more than a daughter when he made that phone call 2 weeks ago. He had lost the right to call himself her father. "I could go to the police," Ralph said weakly. "Report him for kidnapping." "Go ahead," Dean said calmly. "Tell them how a man kidnapped a girl by paying her father $5,000 with her father's consent and cooperation. I'm sure they'll be very interested in that story." Ralph understood that he had no legal ground to stand on, no moral authority to claim, no leverage except the desperate hope that blood relationships mattered more than the demonstrated ability to provide safety and care. "This isn't over," he said. But the words carried no conviction, only the empty threat of someone who had already lost the war but hadn't yet admitted defeat. After Ralph's car disappeared down the driveway, trailing smoke and broken promises, Callie and Dean stood in the garage's doorway, watching the dust settle on the gravel road. "You okay?" Dean asked. "I think so. It's strange, you know? I always thought that if I ever got away from him, I'd feel sorry for him. But I don't. I just feel free," Dean nodded, understanding that freedom sometimes looked like abandonment to people who had never learned the difference between love and possession. "Come on," he said, picking up the automotive manual. "Let's go inside and start Chapter 1. You've got a lot to learn if you're going to help me fix Mrs. Patterson's car." As they walked toward the house, Callie felt the weight of her father's visit settling into memory rather than trauma. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between the familiar patterns of the past and the uncertain possibilities of the future. But today, she had homework to do and skills to learn and a man who believed she was worth teaching. Today, she was exactly where she belonged. The hidden adoption documents lay beneath a stack of automotive invoices in Dean's filing cabinet, their legal language translated into hope through the careful preparation of a lawyer who specialized in cases where families were born from choice rather than biology. Dean had been working with Margaret Chen, no relation to the Mrs. Chen who owned the restaurant, for 3 weeks, building a case for permanent guardianship that would protect Callie from anyone who might claim ownership of her future. The papers represented more than legal protection. They represented Dean's commitment to making their unconventional family official in the eyes of the law. But as he stood in his kitchen on this grey November morning, reading the text message that would change everything, Dean understood that some threats couldn't be solved with paperwork and good intentions. "We know where you live. We know about the girl. Payment. Due in full by midnight or we collect what we're owed plus interest." The message had come from a number Dean didn't recognize, but the meaning was clear enough to make his hand tighten around his coffee cup until his knuckles turned white. Vincent Torino had decided that $5,000 wasn't sufficient payment for Ralph Henderson's debt, and the men who had allowed Dean to walk away with Callie had apparently been planning a different kind of collection all along. Through the kitchen window, Dean could see Callie in the garage, her head bent over the engine of a 1985 Ford pickup that belonged to Tom Morrison from the hardware store. She had progressed from reading manuals to hands-on repairs, with the focused intensity of someone who had discovered that understanding how things worked gave her power over forces that had once seemed beyond her control. Over the past month, Dean had watched her transform from a frightened girl who jumped at unexpected sounds into a young woman who asked questions about hydraulic systems and spoke confidently about compression ratios. She had enrolled at Jefferson High as an emancipated minor, using Dean's address and a carefully crafted story about family circumstances that satisfied the administration without revealing details that might invite unwanted scrutiny. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. The gossip in Pine Ridge had settled into the predictable patterns of small-town scandal, with Dean cast as either a predator who had taken advantage of a vulnerable girl or a saint who had rescued her from something worse. Most people chose to believe whichever version fit their existing opinion of human nature, and Dean had learned to ignore the whispers that followed him through Morrison's Hardware and Murphy's Tavern. But Callie's integration into the community had been more complex. Her classmates treated her with the careful distance reserved for people whose stories were too dramatic for casual friendship. while her teachers navigated the delicate balance between concern for her welfare and respect for her obvious intelligence and determination. She's remarkably resilient. Mrs. Patterson had told Dean during a parent-teacher conference that felt surreal to both of them. Her grades are excellent, and she's caught up on all the coursework she missed. But she keeps to herself. I wonder if she might benefit from counseling. Dean had agreed to the counseling, understanding that healing from trauma required more than safe housing and automotive repair manuals. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, a therapist who worked with at-risk youth, had been meeting with Callie twice a week, helping her process experiences that no 16-year-old should have to carry. She's doing well, Dr. Reeves had reported after a month of sessions. She's developed healthy coping mechanisms and shows no signs of the attachment disorders we often see in cases like hers. Whatever you're doing, Mr. Hartwell, it's working. What Dean was doing, he had realized, was something he had learned in the military, but never applied to civilian life, treating each day as a mission with clear objectives and measurable outcomes. The mission was simple: help Callie build a life where her past informed her strength rather than defining her limitations. The objectives included education, emotional support, practical skills, and legal protection. The outcomes were measured in her growing confidence, her willingness to make plans for the future, and her ability to trust that the adults in her life would keep their promises. Now, staring at the text message that threatened to destroy everything they had built, Dean felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had once motivated him to walk point through Afghan minefields. The difference was that in Afghanistan, he had been responsible for the lives of trained soldiers who had volunteered for danger. Here he was responsible for a girl who had never chosen to be in harm's way, but had simply been born into circumstances beyond her control. Dean's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts with the sharp sound of immediate urgency. The caller ID showed his sister Margaret's number, and Dean answered with the automatic alertness of someone who understood that family only called during work hours when something was wrong. "Dean, oh, thank God you answered." Margaret's voice carried the breathless quality of someone who had been running. "I just got a call from that lawyer, Margaret Chen. She said men came to her office asking questions about Callie's guardianship case. Intimidating questions. What kind of questions? The kind that made her think she needed to call both you and the police. Dean, these people know about the legal proceedings. They know you're trying to adopt her." Dean closed his eyes, understanding that Vincent Torino's organization was more sophisticated than he had initially assessed. These weren't just street-level debt collectors. They were connected people with resources that included information networks and the kind of legal awareness that made them dangerous in ways that went far beyond physical violence. "Where's Callie now?" Margaret asked. "In the garage, working on Tom Morrison's truck. Get her inside. Lock the doors." "And Dean, that gun you brought back from Afghanistan, you still have it?" "Yes." "Good. I'm calling the sheriff's department." Dean hung up and walked to the kitchen window, studying the familiar landscape of his property with eyes that had been trained to identify potential threats and defensive positions. The garage sat 50 yards from the house, connected by a gravel driveway that offered no cover for someone moving between buildings. The nearest neighbor was half a mile away, too far to provide immediate assistance if trouble arrived. He had faced similar tactical situations in Afghanistan, but those had involved soldiers who understood the risks and had been trained to respond to them. Callie was 16 years old and had just begun to trust that the world might contain more safety than danger. How could he explain that the men who had sold her to him might be coming to collect her again, and that this time they wouldn't be interested in money? Dean walked to the garage, his footsteps crunching on gravel that had been frozen by the morning's frost. Callie looked up from Tom Morrison's engine compartment, her face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complex problem. "I figured out why it was running rough," she announced, holding up a spark plug that was fouled with carbon deposits. "Mr. Morrison hasn't had a tune-up in probably 30,000 miles. "That's good work," Dean said. his voice carrying a calmness that required conscious effort to maintain. "But I need you to come inside for a few minutes. We need to talk." Something in his tone made Callie's smile fade, replaced by the alert wariness she had developed during years of reading adult moods for signs of danger. "What's wrong?" "Nothing we can't handle. But I need to explain some things, and I'd rather do it inside." Callie cleaned her hands on a shop rag and followed Dean toward the house, her eyes scanning their surroundings with the automatic awareness of someone who had learned to expect trouble even in places that felt safe. Inside, Dean gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table while he moved to the window that offered the best view of the driveway. The adoption papers lay spread across the table where he had been reviewing them before Margaret Chen's call, their legal language suddenly seeming inadequate against the kind of threat that arrived in text messages and intimidating visits to lawyers' offices. "Callie," Dean began, choosing his words with the care of someone defusing an explosive device. "Do you remember the men who were at the gas station that night? Vincent and Bear? I'm not likely to forget them. They've been in contact. They seem to think our transaction wasn't completed to their satisfaction." Callie's face went pale, but her voice remained steady when she spoke. "What do they want?" "More money. And probably you." The words settled between them, like smoke from a fire that was already spreading, filling the room with the acrid smell of danger that no amount of legal paperwork could extinguish. Callie stared at the adoption documents, understanding for the first time that some kinds of freedom came with a price that had to be paid more than once. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Dean moved away from the window and sat across from her at the table, his hands folded with the calm precision of someone who had made difficult decisions in difficult circumstances before. "We're going to face this the same way we've faced everything else, together, honestly, and with the understanding that some fights are worth having, even when you're not sure you can win them. You think we can win? I think we can try. And sometimes that's all anyone can do." Outside, the November wind carried the scent of coming winter, of storms that would test the strength of everything that hadn't been built to last. But inside Dean's kitchen, surrounded by adoption papers and the quiet determination of a man who had learned to keep promises even when keeping them was dangerous, Callie felt something she had never experienced before, the certainty that someone would fight for her, not because they owned her or owed her, but because they had chosen to love her. The fight that was coming would test everything they had built together. But for the first time in her life, Callie understood that she wouldn't have to face it alone. Dean's service pistol lay in its locked case beneath his bed, wrapped in the same oilcloth that had protected it through 2 tours in Afghanistan and 3 years of civilian storage. The Glock 19 had saved his life more than once, in places where survival depended on quick decisions and accurate aim. But Dean had hoped never to need it again, in a country where laws were supposed to protect people from the kind of violence that thrived in darker corners of the world. Now, as evening shadows lengthened across his property and the deadline approached with the inevitability of a train schedule, Dean cleaned the pistol with the methodical precision of someone preparing for a mission where mistakes would be measured in lives rather than property damage. Sheriff's Deputy Karen Walsh sat at Dean's kitchen table, her radio crackling, with routine traffic that seemed to belong to a different world than the one where 16-year-old girls were sold to pay gambling. Debts and desperate fathers made decisions that haunted everyone involved. Deputy Walsh was a 20-year veteran who had seen enough of human nature to understand that the law sometimes moved too slowly to protect people who needed protection right now. "We've got a patrol car positioned at the end of your driveway," she explained, consulting notes she had taken during phone calls to colleagues in jurisdictions where Vincent Torino's organization operated. "Another unit is stationed on Route 9, and we've got backup 20 minutes away if things escalate." 20 minutes is a long time when bullets start flying, Dean observed, checking the pistol's action with movements that were automatic after years of practice. "It is, But legally, we can't do much more until they actually commit a crime on Montana soil. Making threats by text message is a crime, but it's not the kind that justifies a SWAT response. Callie sat in the living room, pretending to read her automotive repair manual while actually listening to every word of the conversation in the kitchen. Over the past 6 hours, she had watched Dean transform from the patient man who taught her about carburetors into someone harder and more focused, someone who moved with the controlled energy of a predator, preparing to defend his territory. The transformation frightened her, not because she doubted Dean's intentions, but because it reminded her that the safety she had begun to take for granted was fragile and temporary. The life they had built together over the past month existed in the spaces between other people's violence, and those spaces were shrinking as midnight approached. "Callie," Dean called from the kitchen, his voice carrying the calm authority she had learned to associate with serious conversations. "Come in here for a minute." She joined them at the table, noting the way Deputy Walsh studied her with the professional assessment of someone trained to recognize victims of various kinds of abuse. The deputy's expression suggested she was seeing something that contradicted whatever assumptions she had brought to this situation. "I need to explain what's going to happen tonight," Dean said, his hands folded on the table with military precision. "These men are coming here because they believe they can intimidate us into giving them what they want. They're used to dealing with people who have no options and no support. But we're not those people," Callie said, understanding beginning to dawn in her voice. "No, we're not. We have legal protection, law enforcement backup, and the kind of resources that most of their victims don't have access to. But that doesn't mean tonight will be easy." Deputy Walsh leaned forward, her expression serious but not unkind. "Callie, I need you to understand something. These men view you as property that was stolen from them. They're not going to be reasonable or willing to negotiate. If they get past our perimeter, if they get into this house, your safety becomes our absolute priority." "What does that mean?" "It means you do exactly what Mr. Hartwell tells you to do when he tells you to do it, without asking questions or trying to help. It means you trust that the adults in this situation know how to handle violence better than you do." Callie nodded, understanding that her courage would be measured not by her willingness to fight, but by her ability to follow instructions that might save everyone's life. "There's something else," Dean said, reaching into a manila envelope that had arrived by courier that afternoon. Margaret Chen finished the guardianship paperwork. "As of 4 o'clock this afternoon, you're legally my daughter in the eyes of Montana law." He handed her a document that bore official seals and signatures, its legal language transformed into something precious by the context of their situation. Callie stared at the papers that made their chosen family official, understanding that Dean had risked everything, his reputation, his safety, his peaceful life, to give her something no one had ever offered before: unconditional protection. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Why would you do this for someone you barely know?" Dean's answer came without hesitation, spoken with the quiet certainty of someone who had discovered his purpose in the midst of defending it. "Because knowing someone isn't about time. It's about recognition. I recognized something in you the first night I saw you at the gas station. Something that reminded me why some fights are worth having even when you're not sure you can win them outside." The sound of vehicles approaching on gravel announced the arrival of company that hadn't been invited but had been expected. Deputy Walsh's radio crackled with updates from the patrol units positioned around Dean's property. Voices reporting movement that suggested Vincent Torino had brought more than just bear to this particular collection call. 3 vehicles, Deputy Walsh said, interpreting the radio traffic for Dean and Callie. "Estimated 6 to 8 individuals. They've stopped at the end of your driveway, probably assessing the situation." Dean moved to the living room window that offered the best view of the approaching vehicles, his movements economical and purposeful. The years had taught him patience in situations like this, the understanding that rushing led to mistakes, and mistakes led to outcomes that couldn't be corrected. "They're going to try talking first," he said, returning to the kitchen where Callie sat clutching her new adoption papers like a talisman against the darkness approaching their home. Men like Vincent prefer intimidation to violence when intimidation works. It's cleaner, quieter, and doesn't attract the kind of attention that's bad for business. And when intimidation doesn't work, Callie asked, then we find out what we're really made of. The sound of footsteps on the front porch announced that the talking phase of the evening was about to begin. Deputy Walsh positioned herself near the front door, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. While her radio transmitted continuous updates to the backup units that were moving closer to Dean's property, Dean checked his pistol one final time before sliding it into the holster he wore beneath his jacket, understanding that some conversations required the kind of authority that came from being prepared for any possible conclusion. "Remember," he said to Callie, his voice carrying the calm assurance of someone who had faced worse situations and survived them. "Whatever happens tonight, you're not alone. You're not property. You're my daughter, and nobody takes my daughter anywhere she doesn't want to go." The knock on the front door came with the measured authority of people who expected to be answered, but Dean took his time approaching it, understanding that every second of delay gave his backup more time to position themselves, and gave Vincent Torino more time to realize that this collection call wasn't going to proceed according to his usual protocols. When Dean finally opened the door, he found Vincent Torino standing on his porch like a salesman selling products that no one wanted to buy. Behind Vincent, Bear and 4 other men waited with the patient stillness of people who were comfortable with violence but preferred to avoid it when possible. "Mr. Hartwell," Vincent said, his voice carrying the false friendliness of someone conducting business that was anything but friendly. "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." "I believe we settled our business a month ago," Dean replied, his body positioned to block any view of the interior of his house, while Deputy Walsh and Callie remained safely behind him. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding about the terms of our arrangement. I think it's time we clarified a few things." Dean studied the men arrayed behind Vincent, noting their positions, their apparent weapons, and the way they moved with the coordinated awareness of people who had worked together before. But he also noted something else, the tension in their postures that suggested they were operating outside their normal territory, facing variables they hadn't encountered in their usual collection activities. "I'm listening," Dean said, his voice carrying none of the fear or desperation that Vincent was accustomed to hearing from people who owed his organization money. "The girl was collateral for a $15,000 debt. You paid $5,000. That leaves $10,000 still outstanding, plus interest and fees. We're here to collect the balance. The girl has a name, and she's not collateral for anyone's debt anymore." Vincent's smile carried the cold amusement of someone who had heard similar defiance before and knew how such conversations usually ended. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your situation. I understand it perfectly. The question is whether you understand yours." The court summons lay on the passenger seat of Dean's truck like a roadmap to justice, its legal language promising a resolution that would either legitimize their unconventional family or tear it apart under the scrutiny of a system that preferred traditional structures to messy human realities. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over family court with the measured wisdom of someone who had seen every possible variation of human dysfunction and occasionally witnessed the kind of transformation that restored faith in people's capacity for redemption. "Mr. Hartwell," Judge Hendricks said, her voice carrying the authority of 30 years on the bench, "this is an unusual case. You're seeking permanent guardianship of a minor who was essentially sold to you by her father to settle gambling debts. Help me understand why this arrangement serves the child's best interests." Dean stood in the witness box, wearing his only suit, a navy blue outfit that had been purchased for Emma's funeral and hadn't been worn since. The courtroom was smaller than he had expected, filled with people whose presence testified to the complex web of relationships that had formed around Callie's story. Margaret Chen, The lawyer who had guided them through the legal maze of guardianship proceedings sat at the plaintiff's table with files that documented every aspect of Callie's life, before and after she moved into Dean's house. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the therapist who had worked with Callie, waited to testify about her psychological evaluation. Mrs. Patterson from Jefferson High had come to speak about Callie's academic progress and emotional stability. At the defendant's table, Ralph Henderson sat with a court-appointed attorney who looked like he wished he were anywhere else. Ralph had lost weight over the past month, his face carrying the hollow appearance of someone who had discovered that sobriety sometimes made the consequences of past actions more vivid rather than less painful. But it was Callie's presence in the courtroom that gave Dean strength to find the words that would determine their future. She sat in the first row behind the plaintiff's table, wearing a blue dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her select for this day, her posture straight with the dignity of someone who had learned to advocate for herself when no one else would. "Your Honor," Dean began, his voice carrying the calm authority he had once used to brief commanding officers in situations where lives depended on clear communication. "I won't pretend that our situation fits traditional definitions of family, but I will tell you that Callie Henderson has taught me something I thought I had forgotten. That love isn't about biology or legal documents. It's about choice." "Explain what you mean by choice, Mr. Hartwell." "Every day for the past 2 months, Callie has chosen to trust me despite having every reason to believe that adults can't be trusted. Every day I've chosen to be worthy of that trust. That's what family means to me. People who choose to love each other even when it's difficult, even when it's inconvenient, even when other people don't understand." Judge Hendricks made notes on the papers before her, her expression revealing nothing about her opinion of Dean's testimony. "Mr. Henderson," she said, turning her attention to Ralph, "you have the right to contest this guardianship petition. Do you wish to do so?" Ralph stood slowly, his hands trembling as he gripped the edge of the defendant's table. For a moment, Dean saw in his face the man who had once read bedtime stories to a little girl who believed her father could protect her from anything. But that man had been replaced by someone who had learned that love sometimes meant admitting you weren't strong enough to provide what someone needed. "No." "Your Honor," Ralph said, his voice barely audible, I don't contest it. Dean Hartwell is a better father to my daughter than I've ever been. She deserves better than I can give her." The words fell into the courtroom's silence like stones into still water, creating ripples that touched everyone present. Callie's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of something more complex that encompassed grief for the father she had lost and gratitude for the one she had found. "Miss Henderson," Judge Hendricks said, addressing Callie directly, "you're 16 years old, which means the court takes your opinion seriously in matters affecting your welfare. Do you want Mr. Hartwell to become your legal guardian?" Callie stood with the poise of someone who had learned to speak truth, regardless of its complexity. "Yes, Your Honor. Dean has given me something I never had before, the chance to believe that my future belongs to me." "Can you elaborate on that?" "Before I lived with Dean, I thought my job was to survive whatever happened to me. He taught me that my job is to decide what I want to happen and then work to make it real. He taught me that I'm worth protecting, worth teaching, worth loving. That's what fathers are supposed to do." Judge Hendricks nodded, making additional notes before consulting the reports that had been submitted by various agencies and professionals who had evaluated Callie's situation. The courtroom waited in silence while she reviewed documents that would determine whether their unconventional family would receive legal recognition. "Dr. Reeves," Judge Hendricks said, calling the therapist to testify, "you've been working with Miss Henderson for 6 weeks. In your professional opinion, has this living arrangement been beneficial to her psychological development?" Dr. Reeves approached the witness stand with the confidence of someone whose expertise had been tested in hundreds of similar cases. "Your Honor, in 30 years of practice, I've rarely seen such dramatic positive change in such a short period of time. When Callie first came to see me, she exhibited classic symptoms of complex trauma: hypervigilance, difficulty forming attachments, persistent feelings of worthlessness. Today, she presents as a resilient, confident young woman with realistic goals and healthy relationships. What do you attribute this change to? Consistent, unconditional support from Mr. Hartwell. He's provided her with something that's unfortunately rare in cases like this: an adult who follows through on promises, who sees her potential rather than her problems, and who has made her welfare his priority without expecting anything in return. Mrs. Patterson testified about Callie's academic performance, describing a student who had not only caught up on missed coursework, but was excelling in advanced classes while maintaining the kind of mature perspective that impressed both teachers and classmates. The testimonies painted a picture of transformation that seemed almost too dramatic to be believable. But Judge Hendricks had seen enough genuine change to recognize it when it appeared in her courtroom. When the last witness finished speaking, she called for a brief recess to review her decision. Outside the courtroom, Dean and Callie waited in the hallway, where afternoon sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward a future they couldn't yet see clearly. Other families moved through the corridor, some celebrating favorable decisions, others dealing with outcomes that would require years to resolve. "Whatever happens," Dean said quietly, "nothing changes between us. Papers don't make families. People do." "I know," Callie replied, her hand finding his with the natural gesture of someone who had learned that some kinds of support were always available. "But it would be nice if the law agreed with us." When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Hendricks had arranged her papers with the precision of someone who had reached a decision she was confident defending. The room fell silent as she prepared to speak words that would either validate their bond or require them to find different ways to protect what they had built. In the matter of the guardianship petition for Callie Henderson, Judge Hendricks began, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority backed by human wisdom. "This court finds that the petitioner, Dean Hartwell, has demonstrated his ability to provide appropriate care, support, and guidance for the minor child." Dean felt Callie's hand tighten in his, understanding that they were about to receive either validation or devastation. "Furthermore," Judge Hendricks continued, "this court finds that the current living arrangement serves the child's best interests and promotes her continued development into a healthy, productive adult. Therefore, the petition for guardianship is granted, effective immediately." The gavel's sound marked the official beginning of their legal family. But Dean and Callie had stopped listening to the formal language of court proceedings. They were focused on each other, on the understanding that their choice to love each other had been recognized by a system that didn't always make room for unconventional forms of grace. As they left the courthouse, Dean carried the official documents that made Callie his daughter in the eyes of the law. But more importantly, he carried the knowledge that some battles were worth fighting even when victory seemed impossible, and that sometimes the most important families were the ones people chose rather than the ones they were born into. Callie's high school diploma plan lay spread across Dean's kitchen table like a map to a future that finally belonged to her. The enrollment papers for Jefferson High's accelerated program would allow her to graduate 6 months early, opening pathways to colleges that had seemed as distant as foreign countries. Just 3 months ago, Mrs. Patterson had helped design a course schedule that would challenge Callie's abilities while acknowledging the unique circumstances of her educational journey. "Montana State has an excellent automotive engineering program," Dean said, pointing to brochures they had requested from universities that offered programs combining Callie's newfound passion for mechanical systems with the academic achievement that had always been her strength. "Full scholarships available for students with your grades and background. And University of Colorado has a program that focuses on sustainable transportation," Callie added, her voice carrying the excitement of someone discovering that her interests might become her career. "Electric vehicles, alternative fuel systems. The kind of engineering that could actually change how people think about cars. They were discussing college applications when the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their planning session. Through the kitchen window, Dean could see 3 black SUVs pulling into his driveway with the coordinated precision of a military operation. But these weren't military vehicles, and the men emerging from them wore the expensive suits and cold. Expressions of people who viewed legal victories as temporary, inconveniences rather than permanent solutions. Vincent Torino stepped out of the lead vehicle, his appearance more polished than during their previous encounters, but his intentions clearly unchanged. Behind him, Bear and 5 other men positioned themselves with the practiced efficiency of people who had conducted similar operations in places where law enforcement response times were measured in hours rather than minutes. "Stay in the kitchen," Dean said to Callie, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone shifting into combat mode. "Call 911. Then get down behind the island and stay there until I tell you it's safe." Dean moved to the living room, where his service pistol waited in the secure case he had positioned for exactly this scenario. The Glock 19 felt familiar in his hands, its weight triggering muscle memory from deployments where survival depended on the ability to make accurate decisions under extreme pressure. Through the front window, he could see Vincent approaching the porch with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the advantages. The court decision that had made Callie legally Dean's daughter, apparently, meant less to Vincent than the debt that Ralph Henderson still owed to his organization. The knock on the front door came, with the measured authority of people who weren't planning to accept rejection as an answer. Dean approached the door with his pistol holstered but accessible, understanding that the next few minutes would determine whether the life he and Callie had built together would survive this final test. "Mr. Hartwell," Vincent said when Dean opened the door, "I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss." "Our business was finished when I paid Ralph Henderson's debt," Dean replied, his body positioned to block any view of the house's interior while maintaining a clear path to defensive positions. That payment covered transportation costs. The principal balance remains outstanding. Dean had anticipated this argument, understanding that men like Vincent operated according to rules that changed whenever changing them provided advantage. "I have a receipt for $5,000, paid in full settlement of all debts. Receipts can be forged. Contracts can be renegotiated. The girl represents collateral that secures a $15,000 obligation. The girl has a name, and she's no longer available as collateral for anyone's debt." Vincent's smile carried the cold amusement of someone who had heard similar defiance before and knew how such conversations typically ended. "Mr. Hartwell, I don't think you fully appreciate your situation." "I appreciate it perfectly. 6 armed men on my property, attempting to collect a debt through intimidation and implied violence. The question is whether you appreciate yours." Dean's words carried a confidence that seemed to surprise Vincent, who had built his reputation on the predictable response of desperate people to overwhelming force. But Dean's military training had taught him to assess tactical situations with clarity that came from understanding how violence actually worked, rather than how it appeared in movies. "You're outnumbered 6-1, Vincent pointed out. "You're trespassing on private property, threatening a minor under legal protection of the state, and conducting illegal debt collection activities in a jurisdiction where your organization has no political protection." As if summoned by Dean's words, the sound of sirens began growing louder in the distance, announcing the approach of law enforcement that had been monitoring the situation since Vincent's vehicles entered Pine Ridge County. Deputy Walsh's voice crackled over the radio in Dean's kitchen, providing updates to backup units that were converging on his property from 3 different directions. Vincent's expression shifted from confident amusement to cold calculation as he realized that this collection call wasn't proceeding according to his usual protocols. The sirens were getting closer, and his tactical advantage was disappearing with each passing second. "This isn't over," Vincent said, stepping back from the door as his men moved toward their vehicles with the efficient haste of people who understood the importance of leaving before law enforcement arrived in sufficient numbers to ask inconvenient questions. Yes, it is, Dean replied, his voice carrying the finality of someone who had made peace with whatever consequences might come from protecting what mattered most. If you come back here, if you contact Callie, if you make any attempt to involve her in your business, you'll discover exactly what one man with proper training can do to 6 men who mistake intimidation for competence. Vincent paused at the edge of the porch, his face revealing the first crack in the professional composure that had carried him through years of successful intimidation. You're threatening me? I'm promising you. There's a difference. The SUVs departed with the same coordination they had arrived with, but their retreat carried the rushed quality of people who had discovered that their intended victim was better prepared for conflict than they had anticipated. Dean watched until their taillights disappeared around the curve that led away from his property, understanding that Vincent Torino's organization would find easier targets than a combat veteran with legal backing and law enforcement support. Inside the kitchen, Callie emerged from behind the island where she had waited during the confrontation, her face pale but her expression resolute. The college brochures still lay spread across the table, their promises of future opportunities undisturbed by the violence that had threatened to destroy everything they represented. Is it really over? She asked. It's really over, Dean confirmed, holstering his pistol and moving to the window to watch the arrival of sheriff's department vehicles that would document the incident and ensure that Vincent understood the legal consequences of any future attempts at intimidation. 3 hours later, after statements had been given and reports had been filed, Dean and Callie sat at their kitchen table, resuming the conversation about college applications that had been interrupted by men who no longer had any power over their future. Montana State or University of Colorado? Dean asked, his voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had successfully protected what mattered most. Both, Callie replied, her smile bright with the confidence of someone who had learned that her future belonged to her. I'll apply to both and see which one offers the best opportunities. Outside, the November evening settled over their property with the peaceful quiet of a place where threats had been faced and overcome. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, planning a future that no one could take away from them. The enrollment papers for Callie's accelerated graduation program lay beside the college brochures, their official language translated into hope by the context of their hard-won security. Some families were born from shared genetics, but theirs had been forged in the crucible of shared courage. And Dean understood that such bonds were stronger than any force that might try to break them. Their future stretched ahead like an open road, filled with possibilities that belonged entirely to them. The family photo sat on Dean's mantelpiece like a declaration of victory over circumstances that had once seemed insurmountable. In the picture, taken 6 months after the final confrontation with Vincent Torino, Dean and Callie stood beside Callie's restored 1967 Mustang, a project they had completed together using skills she had learned in his garage and determination they had both discovered during their shared journey from strangers to family. Callie wore her graduation cap and gown, having completed high school 3 months ahead of schedule, with grades that earned her full scholarships to 3 universities. Beside her, Dean smiled with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had found purpose in the most unexpected place, who had learned that saving someone else had somehow saved himself in the process. I still can't believe we actually finished it, Callie said, running her hand along the Mustang's perfectly restored fender. The car had arrived at Dean's garage as a rusted shell that someone was ready to abandon, but they had seen potential beneath the damage and worked methodically to reveal the beauty that had been hidden by years of neglect. Metal doesn't forget its original shape, Dean replied. using the same words he had spoken during their first automotive lesson. Sometimes it just needs someone patient enough to help it remember. The metaphor had become their shared understanding of restoration, not just for cars, but for people who had been damaged by circumstances beyond their control. Over the past year, they had learned that healing happened in layers, with each small repair strengthening the foundation for the work that followed. Pine Ridge had gradually accepted their unconventional family, though the process had required time and consistent evidence that their bond was genuine rather than predatory. Mrs. Garcia had been the first neighbor to bring them a casserole, followed by Mr. Peterson, who had asked Dean to look at his lawnmower and stayed for coffee that stretched into conversations about loss and redemption. The gossip had never completely disappeared, but it had evolved from suspicious whispers into something closer to respectful curiosity about how to. People who had started with nothing in common had built something that looked increasingly like the kind of family everyone secretly wished they had. "Your father called again yesterday," Dean mentioned, checking the oil level in the Mustang's perfectly tuned engine. "He's been sober for 8 months now. Still asking if you'd be willing to see him." Callie considered this information while wiping imaginary dust from the car's chrome bumper. Her relationship with Ralph remained complicated, colored by forgiveness that came in waves rather than sudden revelations. She had agreed to supervised visits twice in the past 6 months, sessions facilitated by Dr. Reeves that allowed father and daughter to acknowledge their shared history without pretending it could be easily repaired. "Maybe for Christmas," she said finally. "Something brief. Something where we can both leave if it gets too hard." Dean nodded, understanding that healing moved at its own pace and couldn't be rushed by good intentions or external pressure. Ralph was learning to be a different person, but Callie was under no obligation to wait for his transformation to reach completion before living her own life. The University of Colorado had accepted Callie into their automotive engineering program with a scholarship that would cover all expenses for 4 years. She would leave for Boulder in 3 weeks, carrying with her not just the academic knowledge she had gained at Jefferson High, but the practical skills she had learned in Dean's garage and the emotional resilience she had developed through their shared journey. "I'm going to miss working on cars with you," she admitted, her voice carrying the wistfulness of someone approaching a transition that was both exciting and bittersweet. "Who says you have to stop? Boulder's only 4 hours away. Plenty of people bring their cars here for work that the dealerships can't handle. You'd let me come back and work in the garage during breaks?" "Callie, this is your home. It always will be, regardless of where your education and career take you. Family doesn't stop being family because of geography." The words settled between them, like a promise that had been kept so many times it no longer required conscious confirmation. Over the past year, they had both learned that family wasn't about shared genetics or legal documents. It was about people who chose to love each other consistently, especially when that choice required courage or sacrifice. Margaret Chen, Dean's sister, arrived for Sunday dinner with her husband and 2 teenage sons, who had gradually accepted Callie as their cousin, despite the unconventional way she had joined the family. The boys, initially suspicious of the girl their uncle had bought at a gas station, now sought her advice about cars and treated her with the casual affection reserved for family members who had proven themselves worthy of inclusion. "Any word from those men who were causing trouble?" Margaret asked during dinner, her question carrying the protective concern of someone who understood that some threats required ongoing vigilance even after they appeared to have been resolved. "Vincent Torino was arrested in Nevada 3 months ago," Dean reported, carving the roast that had become their Sunday tradition. "Interstate trafficking charges. He's looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. And Ralph? Clean and sober, working at the lumber mill again, paying his debts the legal way." The conversation moved on to lighter topics: Callie's college plans, the boys' upcoming basketball season, Margaret's promotion at the hospital, but underneath ran the quiet satisfaction of people who had weathered serious storms and emerged stronger for the experience. After dinner, Dean and Callie walked around the property that had become their shared sanctuary, checking on projects and enjoying the peaceful evening air that carried the scent of approaching autumn. The land showed evidence of their partnership everywhere. The vegetable garden Callie had planted in the spring. The workshop Dean had expanded to accommodate their automotive projects. The porch swing they had installed together after deciding that some evenings required nothing more than quiet, conversation, and the pleasure of watching shadows lengthen across familiar ground. "I have something for you," Dean said as they reached the garage where the Mustang waited like a promise kept. From his jacket pocket he withdrew a small velvet box that contained a simple gold ring bearing an inscription that read "Chosen Family." "It's not an engagement ring," he explained with a smile that carried equal parts humor and sincerity. "It's a promise ring. A reminder that some bonds are stronger than blood, some families are built rather than born, and some love is too important to depend on anyone else's approval." Callie accepted the ring with hands that trembled slightly, understanding that Dean was offering her something more precious than jewelry. He was offering her a symbol of their commitment to each other that would survive whatever challenges the future might bring. "Thank you," she said, slipping the ring onto her right hand where it caught the light from the garage's overhead fixture. "For everything. For seeing something in me that I couldn't see in myself. For teaching me that I was worth saving." "You saved yourself, Callie. I just provided a safe place for you to do it." They stood in comfortable silence, surrounded by the tools and equipment that had become the instruments of their shared education in restoration and repair. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to prove that love could triumph over circumstances that seemed designed to defeat it. But tonight, they were exactly where they belonged, together in a place they had built through patience, courage, and the revolutionary understanding that families could be chosen rather than assigned, that healing was possible even after the worst kinds of damage, and that sometimes the most important rescues were the ones that saved both the rescued and the rescuer. The future stretched ahead like an open road, filled with possibilities that belonged entirely to them, and for the first time in either of their lives, they understood that they would face whatever came next, not as isolated individuals struggling against overwhelming odds, but as a family united by choice, strengthened by adversity, and committed to proving that love, once freely given, could overcome anything the world might try to place in its path. In the photograph on the mantelpiece, their smiles told the story of two people who had found each other in the darkest circumstances and discovered that together they could build something stronger than either had ever imagined possible. It was a story that would continue for years to come, written in the language of daily kindness, sustained commitment, and the quiet revolution of people who chose to love each other, not because it was easy, but because it was right.